And here we have a little book called Cycles of Time, Charting the Mood Swings of America by Jacqueline White, which is a book on mundane astrology. So they're all falling over now, but I'll pick them up later. And this is called The Answer You Seek Is Here. You can hardly read this because it's very, very dark in the print, but this is another book by Margaret Carter, this time together with Alan Carter. It's a very early book of theirs, which I thought would be interesting to have together with the other books on unitology and so on that they have produced. This little book called The United States Wheel of Destiny by Diana Bills Stone, published by the AFA, which is about the chart of the United States, I think, and so it's a work of American mundane astrology. Here we have Down to Earth Astrology by Robert Malkins, and this is one of 3 books of his. They're all slim books, and they're all reasonably scarce and not particularly well known today, but quite popular in their day, which I think was sort of the 70s. And here's another little basic book by Albert Benjamin. This one is The Beginner's Horoscope Maker, published by the Aries Press in Chicago, in common with many of his books. And this is the first edition, I think, of Ivy Goldstein Jacobson's The Dark Moon Lilith in Astrology. A very nice condition, this one. More Margaret Carter stuff here. This is a later edition of The Greatest 5 Years of Your Life according to your birth date, which was a hardback book. There's also an earlier edition here which covers a different time period. Both of these books give predictions for the various signs for the next 5 years as of the time they were published, but this earlier edition was published much earlier, so the predictions are completely different. So really both are quite separate as far as their main content is concerned. Here is, I think, a first edition of Bernice Brill Grebner's Decanates book, which was an A4-sized book with staples. Later editions produced by the AFA in the 80s and 90s, or the later 80s and 90s, have just been much smaller books with a different design. This is a book called The Circle Book of Charts by Stephen Erlewine, who I think may be a brother of Michael Erlewine, and this is a large collection of drawings of charts of various different well-known people, and it's also quite a common book, so it must have been a very strong seller in its day, I can only suppose. This is a little book called Planetary Keywords for Students and Astrologers by Dr. Gustav Ekstrom. It's become a very scarce book indeed, and I had to pay quite a bit of money for this one. It's another large format A4 book, and it was produced, I think, in the 1930s, possibly 1940s, I don't remember offhand, and so somewhat after Manly P. Hall's book on astrological keywords, but Ekstrom's research and his opinions are quite distinctive. Here we have another A4-sized book, this one Forecasting in a Nutshell by Claire Stickle, published by the AFA. Maybe it's Claire Stickle, I'm really not sure how to pronounce a lot of names, so I apologise for any mistakes I may be making. And this is another A4 book published by the AFA, I think, a course in Basic Astrology and its Phraseology by Mai Wilson Ludlam, who has published quite a few little books, some of them with quite obscure sounding names, but nonetheless interesting to investigate. And this is a little book called Your Personal Chart, which is a very, very early book by Jack Gillen, who is best known for his work on the New York Stock Exchange and how to forecast astrologically. But he's done various other books related to gambling and speculation as well. But this was just a simple, really simple little primer of natal astrology that he produced in the earliest 1970s, I think. This is a photocopy. You can't actually see what's inside, but it's a bound photocopy of the first edition of a book called The Instant Astrologer by Thomas Stanton, and this was a work on Western sidereal astrology. There was a later edition done jointly with James Eshelman called The New Instant Astrologer, which is a hardback book and much more common than this. Here we have a book called The Instant Astrology Workbook by Louise Ward, and this was also, I think, a book from the 1970s, which has become reasonably scarce. It's a kind of beginner's book which has various worksheets laid out and encourages you to use them as a practical way to learn astrology. And there have been others more recently, like Demetra George's book, that have done this same sort of thing, but this was an example of its time. And finally, we have a whole lot of fairly recent back issues of the ISA magazine.